I'm Joe Lowenstein, the director of the Interdisciplinary Project in the Humanities, and today I have the best gig in the university, since it's my privilege to introduce William Wallace, the Bryant Distinguished Professor of Art History. Over the past few years, IPH, usually with the support of the Center for the Humanities, has hosted some remarkable scholars. Last year, the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Marilynne Robinson. A few years earlier, the great theorist of race and the law, Patricia Williams. Historians like Gary Wills, Sean Wilentz, Lynn Hunt, or Carolyn Walker Bynum. But it's inauguration week here at Washington University, and it seems especially fitting that those of us on the Hilltop campus should have the pleasure of celebrating our own indigenous intellectual achievements. So I'm glad that it's Bill who will speak to us this week in 3 lectures on 3 lives, all of them Michelangelo's. This is hardly the first time that one of our own has offered the annual Distinguished Humanities Lecture Series. Mark Jordan gave lectures on Nietzsche, Weil, and Foucault, Carl Phillips on morality and the metaphysics of desire, and there have been others, professors of English, of history, and American culture studies. None of them is quite as prolific as Professor Wallace has been, 8 books by my count, but most had scholarly reputations that are arguably in or approaching his league. And one of them may have had as soaring a reputation as a lecturer or undergraduate teacher as the person to whom you'll be listening this week. Which is to say 2 things. First, that important rewards accrue when we stop and reflect on each other's work. And second, that the rewards to which we can look forward today, tomorrow, and Friday might be quite special. But there's one more thing to say, which is that however special these lectures promise to be, they are also, in a sense, locally situated. Professor Wallace will be speaking about Michelangelo, to whose achievements he has devoted most of a scholarly career, and it's that focal devotion that situates his work here at Washington University. To work on a figure, after all, has its risks, but we do it. As many of you know, during the past half-century, scholars of the humanities have reflected critically on the informal list of writers, philosophers, musicians, and artists that have been treated for decades in some cases and for centuries in others as unarguably great or central. This critical reflection has largely focused on what the list has excluded, and the relevant remedies have been both greater inclusion and a reassessment of what have been the criteria, explicit and implicit, for prior inclusions. But the practical work of inclusion and the theoretical work of understanding what we have meant by greatness has been accompanied by some more radical departures, some of them overlapping, sometimes a resistance to the very practice and institutions of canonization, sometimes a critique of the very idea of greatness, and sometimes a resistance to individualism itself, a resolution not to privilege so-called great practitioners, the likes of Woolf, Fanon, Shakespeare, Arendt, Baldwin, or Michelangelo. Over the past half-century, it has been more strenuously urged that we may be hobbling ourselves when we think about culture in terms of individual achievement, at the cost of neglecting the achievements of groups, movements, whole ecosystems of culture. And contemporary intellectuals have made some enormous strides in thinking about collective or systemic achievement. I won't rehearse those achievements, since my purpose has been to point out that the scholars on this campus have nonetheless sustained a powerful commitment to the work of individuals. Liz Childs, Bill Wallace's colleague, has sustained a few decades of engagement with Gauguin. Harriet Stone has great books on Vermeer. Stephanie Kirk thinks and writes through and for Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Dolores Pesce has settled on Liszt, David Lawton on Chaucer. A few of us have split allegiances. For Vivian Pollock, it's Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. For Michael Sherberg, it's Tasso and Boccaccio. Well, for me, it's Johnson and Spencer. But many of our most creative faculty have led centripetal planetary intellectual lives, as Bill Wallace has. If Steve Zwicker veered brilliantly off course with a book on Marvell, his career has revolved consistently around the life and work of Dryden. So much has been gained by scholarly inquiry into systemic productivity and collective achievement, but when we look at the collective achievement of our own intellectual ecosystem, we might consider what has been gained by Liz's work on Gauguin, Steve's on Dryden, or Stephanie's on Sor Juana. At a political moment at which we might be tempted to think ourselves powerless before larger forces, it is salutary to ask for individuals, ask for us to assess individuals and to study how they assess their circumstances and act, how Vermeer develops a distinctive way of seeing, or Whitman rouses himself both to reimagine and remake a postbellum nation. It is useful, surely, to show our students how careers unfold, from achievement to reversal, to minor and then to major advance, so that they might develop the confidence to project their own unfolding lives in terms of engaged agency. We look to scholars like Professor Wallace to narrate the relation between situation and effort, between collective agency and individual inflection. Of course, I haven't read Bill's lectures for this week, but I'm willing to wager that what we can expect as he isolates three distinct biographical threads in Michelangelo's career is three braidable lessons in creative engagement, models of resolution and retrenchment, bulk and breakthrough. Please welcome Professor William Wallace.
Thank you, Joe. I think I might have helped write that introduction. It was the perfect introduction to what I want to say. Thank you very much for coming. This is an extraordinarily busy week. We're, East End campus dedication, the Chancellor's installation. I very much appreciate your coming today. Let us imagine a time 469 years ago. It's a gloomy and rainy afternoon in Rome. It's not 93 degrees or like today, but it is late September, but September 1550. A wet, bedraggled 75-year-old artist dismounts his horse and climbs the narrow stairs to the office of the Vatican Treasury. There he awaits for a self-important papal servant to take notice of him and accept the signed bill for payment due to the artist of 6 scudi, a goodly sum, something like $900. The papal bureaucrat, a miserable cockalorum that the artist refers to as Messer Tante Cose, Mr. Busybody, is irritatingly slow in scratching the entry into his giant ledger and recording its reason. The artist is to be paid for having gilded, in true gold, 8 knobs on the papal bedstead. Mr. Busybody writes the entry, then laboriously copies it into a second, cross-referenced account book, and finally disappears to retrieve the sum of money owed to the dripping artist. The account book entry, which still exists in the Vatican archives, permits us to read the payment to Michelangelo Pittore. And one might imagine that this Michelangelo the painter to be a specialist in gilding papal bedsteads and chamber pots. But in fact, this is the world-famous sculptor, painter, architect, poet, and engineer, Michelangelo Buonarroti. However, in September 1550, to the self-important Vatican functionary, he was just another employee on the papal payroll. Michelangelo was the foremost sculptor of the Renaissance. He carved the miraculous Pietà in St. Peter's at an age when most students are just graduating from college. He fashioned an abandoned and nearly ruined block of marble into the 17-foot-high David. And although he had little training in the art of fresco, that is the demanding technique of painting on damp plaster, he painted a magnificent vision of God's creation for the Sistine Chapel ceiling. As a great German writer, Johann Goethe, observed, "Until you have seen the Sistine Chapel, you can have no adequate idea of what humankind is capable of achieving." This is the heroic Michelangelo, the protagonist of the agony and the ecstasy, the movie version of which culminates with Charlton Heston painting the Sistine ceiling. Michelangelo was just 37 years old when he completed that work. He would live another 52 years, twice the expected lifetime in the filthy, disease-ridden, and violent world of Renaissance Italy. When Pope Julius II insisted that Michelangelo paint the ceiling of his chapel, Michelangelo's response was, "I'm not a painter." True, he had never painted a fresco in his life, much less one with nearly 300 figures on an irregularly curved vault 65 feet above the chapel floor. In the next 4 years, Michelangelo learned what he needed to know and painted one of the greatest paintings of all time. When Pope Paul III appointed Michelangelo as architect of St. Peter's, the largest building project in all of Christendom, Michelangelo justifiably responded, "Architecture is not my profession." True again. He had no formal training, and he only became an architect in his 40s. He did not have the education, the experience, or the authority to carry out such a gigantic undertaking at St. Peter's. But one does not say no to the Pope. Thus did Michelangelo, the sculptor and painter, also become one of the greatest and most influential architects of all time. But he also became an engineer, another profession in which he had no college courses or formal training. Ask anyone, who's the greatest engineer of the Renaissance? And the answer invariably will be Leonardo da Vinci. But Leonardo never built anything. Michelangelo just did it. St. Peter's was the aesthetic and engineering feat of the century, of many centuries. It still stands, dominating and defining the skyline of Rome. Welcome, and thank you very much for coming, at least to this first lecture, and hopefully to one or two more. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I'd like to thank Joe Lowenstein and the Interdisciplinary Project in the Humanities for the opportunity to present these 3 lectures, which focus on Michelangelo's success as an entrepreneur, his status as an aristocrat, and finally, his old age as an octogenarian. Michelangelo was a protean and versatile artist who created masterpieces of sculpture, painting, architecture, and poetry. And as the Pope's supreme architect, he was responsible for overseeing all sorts of work, from building St. Peter's to gilding the knobs of the papal bedstead. Michelangelo was 75 years old when he stood before Mr. Busybody's paper-piled desk. Given that life expectancy in the Renaissance was between 40 and 45, Michelangelo had already expected to die for some 35 years. Yet, after gilding bed knobs, Michelangelo still had nearly 15 years to live and the largest church in the world to build, St. Peter's. Indeed, he had an incredibly full and eventful career in his 70s and 80s, which only ended when he died a few weeks shy of his 89th birthday. Michelangelo never retired. A few days before he died, he was carving this marble sculpture. Have you ever tried carving marble? At 88? It's not an easy task, even with just 3 chisels, and I will return to those 3 chisels at the end of my lecture. In Michelangelo's so-called Rondinini Pietà, a standing Mary barely supports the slumping body of her crucified, emaciated son. Although radically incomplete, the sculpture remains a haunting and moving work, worthy of display even in its abortive condition. This was an artist whose energy and creativity never waned. I've been researching, writing, and publishing on Michelangelo for well over half my life, and I'm willing to admit my age. I'm 67. I now, as Joe pointed out, published 8 books and far too many articles to count on the artist. It's excessive, but not obsessive. I love what I do, and I feel that I've not yet even exhausted my subject. And for that, I'm grateful to several mentors who offered good advice early in my career. And thus, for any students in the audience, I'd like to pass along some of that good advice. First, work on important topics, things that truly engage you and that will hold your interest 5, 10, or 20 years from now. A tongue-in-cheek corollary to that advice was, study in a country where you like the food. And the second serious bit of imparted wisdom was that there is no such thing as a definitive book or a last word on an important subject. Every generation has new questions, new perspectives, and new methods that yield new insights. Starting out as an enthusiastic young researcher wishing to enter the academic field, I was told by more than one established scholar, there's nothing left to say about Michelangelo. Just look at the scholarship, 200 years and thousands of books and articles in every conceivable language. Here is a part of my own 800-volume Michelangelo library. Daunted by the literature and a bit deflated by these negative reactions, I returned to my advisor, Howard Hibbert at Columbia, for some kind of advice. He, who had already published one of the best and most readable books on Michelangelo, one that I still assign to my students, reclined his large frame in his fat office chair and responded, "Well, screw them." And that's when he imparted to me the observation that every generation has something new to say about great art and artists. And more importantly, the past rewards our attention and deserves to be remembered, honored, and celebrated. These 3 lectures are a perfect way to package what I'd like to share with you. My 3 subtitles, Entrepreneur, Aristocrat, and Octogenarian, capture the stories I'd like to tell by identifying 3 aspects and 3 chronological phases of Michelangelo's life. These 3 subtitles also nicely characterize the 3 most important books I've written on the artist. My first book, Michelangelo at San Lorenzo, actually had the word entrepreneur in its subtitle, The Genius as Entrepreneur. In 1994, when that book was published, the word entrepreneur gave people pause because it seemed anachronistic. Yet it was actually genius that proved much more problematic, partly for the reasons that Joe mentioned in his introduction. The word was just then going out of fashion with postmodern criticism and literature's embrace of the idea of the death of the author. How could you have a genius if there was no author? Fortunately, I got over these temporary hang-ups, and both words survived in my subtitle. My second lecture focuses on aristocrat. Aristocrat neatly describes a dimension of Michelangelo that was previously mostly unknown to the general public. Yet in many ways, it was the most important concern of the artist and central to what we now call his self-fashioning. My biography emphasized the importance of Michelangelo's family and noble origins, and how he balanced being a patrician aristocrat while working as an artist and a manual laborer. And finally, octogenarian. What book is ever going to sell with that in its title? The word is not in the title of my most recent book, but it is certainly its subject. What we can accomplish in the busiest and most creative years of our lives, our 70s and our 80s. Among many other things, Michelangelo built St. Peter's. Octogenarian, here I come. What are you going to do in your 70s and 80s? Those are my 3 lecture titles and 3 of my books. But how did an assistant professor find his way into what was once described to me as the minefield of Michelangelo's studies? Along with Plato, Dante, Shakespeare, Mozart, and a few others, Michelangelo has inspired one of the great scholarly literatures of all time. Many excellent writers have trained their eyes and mind on this titan, and I've been the beneficiary. You might think that an artist like Leonardo would be similar, but while some great scholars have written on Leonardo, the field is also littered with the drivel of earnest and self-taught amateurs, inventors, conspiracy theorists, and a rash of slightly deranged fools and outright kooks. And this includes my own worst contribution to this unchecked effluence for the television series Ancient Aliens, which seems to be the only thing that any of my students ever discover about me from YouTube. In contrast, Michelangelo's scholarship, for the most part, offers a very solid foundation. To continue our Trinitarian theme, I'd like to highlight the importance of just 3 authors from among hundreds. The first would be the great Victorian aesthete, John Addington Symonds, who published a biography of the artist in 1893. Symonds, a complicated and conflicted soul himself, was extremely sensitive to aspects of Michelangelo largely ignored in the celebration of his genius, his singularity, and his terribilità, or terribleness. That is, Symonds was one of the first to immerse himself in Michelangelo's letters and poetry, reading with sympathy and considerable, albeit reserved, Victorian sensitivity. It is a tribute to Symonds' biography that more than 100 years later, it is still in print in a modern critical edition. Our second author is the doyen of Michelangelo's studies, Charles de Tolnai. Tolnai published in at least 4 different languages, including his native Hungarian, which was the only spoken tongue apparently that anyone could ever understand. He lived through the turmoil of the Second World War, found refuge in Italy, and became the director of the Casa Buonarroti, the family house that Michelangelo purchased in Florence and which became a museum when the family died out in 1853. As the museum director, Tolnai actually lived in the house and almost became Michelangelo himself, treating the precious documents and drawings in the family archive as his personal papers. I recall as a young graduate student writing to Tolnai, asking permission to see some of the precious drawings for an article I was writing. His response was worthy of Catch-22. Have you seen the drawings? Well, no. Well, if you've not seen the drawings, then you cannot consider yourself an expert enough to publish on the drawings. And our third author, third book, what might be the one book that you, my audience, have actually read about the artist? Or better still, what's the terrifically bad movie that one cannot help but love that you might have seen as teenagers or as a late-night classic flick? Yes, The Agony and the Ecstasy. Charlton Heston as Michelangelo, also Ben-Hur and Moses, and the wonderful Rex Harrison as the imperious Pope Julius II. If you've never read the book, it's a good read, especially for an 18-year-old experiencing Europe for the first time, as I did. Irving Stone's novel, and it is a novel, was first published in 1951 and is still in print in 52 languages. Here is Stone sitting among all of its editions. Although I aspire to reach a broad audience, I doubt if any of my books are still going to be in print in 70 years from now. Before writing my biography of Michelangelo, I decided to reread The Agony and the Ecstasy. It was fascinating and a revelation. Is it all true? As the Italians say, if it's not true, it should be. Stone had done his homework, having published an edition of Michelangelo's nearly 500 letters. Thus, he was able to pepper his novel with the flavor of the man living during the Italian Renaissance. We hear Michelangelo's complaining, aggrieved voice, the agony of his title. It was a novel based on documents, although it left aside the more than 900 untranslated letters that were written to Michelangelo. Those letters helped describe an artist's social world of about 1,100 persons, and that world was the foundation of my biography. And since Stone published his book in the era of Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver, he whitewashed Michelangelo's complicated sexual feelings. Nonetheless, Stone tells a good story, and sometimes I wish we academics did that more often. So there we have three writers, three different ways to approach the artist. How was I supposed to say something new? It's 1976. I'm teaching in Bologna, Italy for Dickinson College. At a friendly scholarly gathering, I'm asked by an eminent Italian scholar, "What is your methodology?" In Italy, this is an important question as it immediately places you in a camp with this or that professional sponsor, which will have important ramifications for your career. So the question, what is your methodology, was a perfectly natural one in Italy, but I was utterly flummoxed. I was naive enough to ask, don't you develop a method appropriate to the question? The important scholar looked at me as if I hadn't graduated yet from high school. I still don't have a methodology. I do not yield iconography, post-structuralism, Derrida, or Lacan as academic weapons. Rather, I think the challenge is to ask good questions and clearly define a problem, and then determine what might be the best way to go about answering the questions raised. These are lists of names written in Michelangelo's own hand found in the Buonarroti archive. My first book arose from a simple but previously unasked question. Who were the approximately 300 persons listed on these sheets that Michelangelo wrote out every week for nearly 2 years? No wonder there had been little interest in such lists. They are banal, and they contradict the notion that Michelangelo was a loner who did everything himself. But I was intrigued by all those names. Who are they? Thanks to the Italian penchant for writing everything down, often in duplicate, and saving every scrap of paper ever written from about the 11th century onwards, one could, with patience, find out a lot about the seemingly anonymous names on those lists. Birth, death, and matriculation dates, family names, places of residence, neighbors and relatives, property and income, and occasional legal disputes. Individuals began to come into focus, such as Gino Intagliatore, a specialized craftsman who carved some of the marble capitals in the Medici chapel that we see below. Instead of 300 faceless individuals, gradually there emerged friends, neighbors, and large family groupings or consortia with multiple personal and professional ties to Michelangelo. Here, for example, are the multiple overlapping relations among 14 persons employed by Michelangelo. You're not supposed to read this. And then I discovered that nearly half of Michelangelo's 300 workers were listed by nickname, which means that he knew his assistants extremely well. We have here, for example, El Mancino and El Manciato, Lefty and Stumpy. And then El Pisano, who evidently hailed from Pisa. In addition, there is the Stick, the Dolt, the Little Liar, Oddball, Fat, Thorny, Knobby, and Gloomy. There were assistants nicknamed the Fly, the Chicken, the Goose, the Horse, the Porcupine, and the Woodpecker, as well as Nero, the Friar, the Priest, the Godfather, the Turk, and the likely butt of many jokes, Anticristo, the Antichrist. One of Michelangelo's most important right-hand men had a pretentiously long name, Domenico di Giovanni di Bertino Fancelli Perroni Santi, but he was commonly referred to as Topolino or Little Mouse. We would call him Mickey Mouse today. Francesco da Sangallo, who we see here listed in 2 successive weeks alongside 95 other workers, but in a separated category of specialized marble carvers who were paid a higher wage, was a well-respected artist who carved portions of the mask frieze in the Medici chapel, seen here behind the famous figures carved by Michelangelo. The master greatly respected Francesco's skill until one week, the young assistant tried to make more money by carving a whole lot of shoddy masks, for which he received a severe reprimand and a dock in pay. He shaped up rather quickly under the discerning eye of his detail-oriented master. Another figure that shows up among Michelangelo's most talented assistants is Giovanni da Montorsoli, who you should all know, since St. Louis is fortunate to own a masterpiece of his, the Drunken Pan, in the St. Louis Art Museum. Names were becoming personalities. The lone genius of the Agony and the Ecstasy was, in fact, a busy, efficient manager organizing and directing a large and complicated business practice with lots of colorful employees. Several of my lists were written on odd scraps of paper, which I guess to be remnants of paper templates, that is, cut out profiles to guide Michelangelo's stone carvers in carrying out his designs. For example, this oddly shaped paper is the leftover portion of a sheet from which Michelangelo cut out the profile molding, here reconstructed in black. That black paper pattern corresponds precisely to the sinuous curve of the small marble brackets decorating the tombs in the Medici Chapel. There are 8 such brackets, and they are identical. And here's my proof, since I received permission to measure them in situ. I was a little bit more nimble then, and I had a lot more hair. And just for your students, you can see that sometimes professors misbehave in doing research. After creating the cutout pattern, Michelangelo then used the leftover scrap of paper to record the names of the 23 stone carvers, including Bondo, Bellagotte, and Brunello, who were working alongside him in the Medici Chapel. And they're probably the very people who are carving those 8 exact identical brackets. And all of them, you can see, are working 6 days a week, except a couple of them 4 days a week, and maybe one 5 days a week. They worked hard. They worked very, very hard under Michelangelo. There would have been hundreds of such paper templates. Most were cut out, transferred into tin, used, and then discarded. 2 other chance survivors are a paper template for the top step of the Laurentian Library stairs, which only survives because after cutting out the molding profile, Michelangelo drafted a sonnet on the leftover scrap. And this is another for the entablature molding over the library door. After cutting the profile, Michelangelo made some notes and recorded 96 bushels of grain delivered from one of his many farm properties. Hence, it survived among his private papers. Imagine Michelangelo hunched over a rickety work table, surrounded by approximately 30 stone carvers and the disorder of the building site with its noise, clutter, and pungent smells. He draws, he cuts, he turns sheets over to an assistant. He drafts the beginning of a sonnet or records farm produce before turning his attention to carving the figures of night and day, dawn and dusk. This is the artist as entrepreneur. At the same time, Michelangelo was building the Laurentian Library. Where and how was he getting the large quantity of gray-green Pietra Serena stone that lends the library its special ambience? The Florentine Archive has a series of survey maps drawn up in the 16th century for tax and census purposes. Several of the maps record the location of numerous quarries called cave, such as you see identified on the road to the left of the building, labeled Monastero della Doccia, Monastery of Doccia. I wondered, could one still track down these sites nearly 500 years later? And so I was drawn from the archives to field research. The former monastery at Doccia, the building crudely drawn on our 16th century map at the left, is now the 5-star Hotel San Michele on the right. I brashly contacted the owner and gained permission to wander around the grounds seeking old stone quarries, even if the sunbathers on the beautifully manicured lawn made me feel distinctly out of place. And yes, their swimming pool and the wine cellar are both old excavations of stone. And sure enough, Just outside the hotel gate was the old road, precisely where it had been indicated on the 16th century survey map. Although now used as a trash dump and buzzing with vicious black flies and stinking to high heaven in the Florentine summer heat, this 30-year-old assistant professor managed to push through the smells, thorns, and overgrown brambles to my small reward, the abandoned road that led up the hillside to this small stone quarry. Please note its modest size, scarcely more than 6 feet tall and wide. These operations were numerous, but of small scale, conducted by family firms. There was as yet no industrial scale production, but Michelangelo needed a huge quantity of stone in a very brief time to build the Laurentian Library. None of these small operations could supply all the material required. Thus, I surmise there must have been many such quarries, which is precisely what was indicated in the documents and what I discovered by tramping around the hills of Florence. Clearly, I was becoming a little more too enthusiastic about stone quarries. The more time I spent walking in the hills around Florence, the more I wondered whether I was really doing research and whether I shouldn't better spend my time in the archives or, better still, writing the book I was supposedly writing. Yet even while I felt a twinge of guilt, I also realized I was matching 500-year-old documents to facts on the ground. For example, I was locating where Michelangelo's assistants had lived. Here is one large farmstead property from where no less than 6 family members came. How long did it take them to walk into the worksite at San Lorenzo? About 45 minutes, and somewhat shorter if they rode into Florence on a farm cart. The workers brought their own tools and their lunch, and they worked 10 to 14-hour days from sunup to sundown. Here is the Laurentian Library and the tall entrance vestibule to the right, both constructed above the old church cloister of San Lorenzo. To build the library and vestibule, Michelangelo required an immense quantity of stone. But aside from the overall quantity, how long did it take to drag those blocks downhill and cart it to San Lorenzo? How were the multiple quarrying operations coordinated and supervised? In the library vestibule, there are 24 columns, each carved from a single block of stone 22 feet tall. The columns were quarried, delivered, and raised into position in a little more than 10 months. 4 of those columns were raised in the space of a single week in June 1526. And since we've just watched a building site go up on the East Campus here, that is a building coordination worthy of a modern building site today. In the margin of this quarry requisition book, each column is indicated by a small sketch suggesting their singular importance and the fact that their delivery to San Lorenzo had to be carefully regulated. Space in the confined cloister and the library vestibule were factors, as was the coordination of hoists required to lift the monolithic 22-foot columns into place, which is the equivalent of the 3rd story. The delivery of stone was staggered such that the quarrying, transport, and allocation of blocks was a well-planned and efficiently directed operation. And what we're seeing here is over 8 months. So the stone had to come in a very, very regulated order. So we're seeing the lower blocks coming in, and then the really important blocks are the long lines, and the columns had to become at a very, very staggered and at a regular time. So they come in at a time, and then finally the upper part of the vestibule comes. So extraordinarily well-coordinated operation. Michelangelo is the inventor of just-in-time delivery operations. Amazon had nothing over him. Here was an unexpected facet of Michelangelo, the artist as craftsman, project manager, and businessman, the genius as entrepreneur. Realizing the full extent of his practical knowledge led me to the even more distant quarries of Carrara and Pietrasanta, some 90 miles from Florence. There are many tales I could tell of time spent in the marble quarries and what I learned from my multiple visits there. Most significantly, I was struck, as Michelangelo had been, by the sheer sublimity of the mountains, both beautiful and extremely dangerous. My guilt in escaping the archives was alleviated by realizing that Michelangelo, too, had been repeatedly drawn to these locales. But what was there to learn? What could a scholar honestly accomplish by following in such distant footsteps? Most importantly, I came to appreciate the full extent of Michelangelo's hands-on knowledge regarding every facet of his artistic operations, including quarrying and transporting his raw material, operations little changed from antiquity to the 19th century, and we're looking at a couple of 19th century photographs. Here was an artist capable of speaking the language of court and curia, but also the everyday language of the quarry master and the lowly carter. I began to appreciate the physical dangers of handling, lifting, and transporting the concentrated weight of marble, and Michelangelo's constant struggles against the twin tyrannies of time and distance. I could tell you of the hours required to make the arduous trek from the nearest village to the quarry site. And here's the nearest village, and this is Michelangelo's quarry. So it's about 3 to 4 hours to go there, and why oftentimes the quarrymen would remain on the mountain for a week or more at a time. They would not trek back and forth every day. I vividly recall being caught on the gravelly detritus of a steep mountain slope and my sudden fear of the height and loose footing. Such recollections would be balanced by the sense of reward in finally reaching the location of one of Michelangelo's remote quarries up here on the left, and discovering some of the paths he built to bring the marble down the mountain, such as you see on the right. And he's building those paths. He had to build those paths to bring the marble down from here to the sea all the way out to there. One viscerally feels the tension on ropes that wore these grooves as the heavy blocks, the largest quarried in more than 1,000 years, were slowly, ever so slowly, brought down the mountain. Imagine the job. Trucks now do it, but it's still extremely hazardous. You might notice here, this is a broad roadway, but sometimes the roads are very, very narrow, and the cut switchbacks are extremely tight. So you notice there's only a single wire that holds the block on, and that's because if the truck is too close to the edge and starts to tilt, instead of the whole truck being pulled over by the weight of the marble block, the driver can actually release the wire and allow the block of marble to go over the side. Of course, we lose several months of quarrying, but at least we don't lose the life of the driver. Local carpenters fashioned wood sleds called litze, on which the marble blocks were lashed during their vertiginous descent from the high mountain quarry. There were numerous severed fingers and occasional deaths when ropes slipped or broke, as did twice when Michelangelo was working there. To hang around the quarries and watch the quarrymen, of whom Dante wrote, "They still smacked of the mountains," is to recover a world relatively unchanged. Strained nerves, dangerously capricious weather, sandwiches thick with lard, the brutal effort to wrestle beauty from geologic slumber. There was no part of my research on Michelangelo that has been more profoundly affected than my repeated experiences in the marble quarries. I came to appreciate an artist who possessed a profound knowledge of every aspect of the projects he undertook, one who simultaneously saw the large and the small picture, a person capable of shuttling between the sublime and the mundane. He was both an artist and a craftsman, a genius and an entrepreneur. For Michelangelo, these were simultaneous and overlapping. So here's the message, my message for all students. Go on location. Or as we used to joke as poor graduate students, beg, borrow, or steal, but go. If not for these many on-location experiences, I never would have come to the radical conclusion that Michelangelo, not Leonardo da Vinci, was the greatest engineer of the Renaissance. We have many drawings that testify to Leonardo's interest and many books lauding him as an engineering genius. In Michelangelo's case, we have the works of art and some of the most spectacular feats of engineering in the entire Renaissance. Michelangelo's engineering expertise was largely gained from quarrying and transporting marble and stone for the Medici Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. For 18 years, between 1515 and his definitive move to Rome in 1534, Michelangelo was occupied with a succession of projects for the church, including a never-completed facade that we see here, the Medici Chapel, and the Laurentian Library. These projects resulted in some of the artist's most famous sculptures in the Medici Chapel and his first major works of architecture, here at the Laurentian Library. Architecture is, for the most part, an extrusion of its local geology. It's expensive and dangerous to transport heavy materials over great distances. Therefore, one generally builds with available materials. It is still true today. Except for steel and glass, one tends to build using local materials. Wood in New England, brick in St. Louis, adobe in the American Southwest. Our own Washington University is built of local materials. That is red granite from Southwest Missouri and white limestone from nearby Indiana. For San Lorenzo, Michelangelo paid no attention to this centuries-old wisdom. He was determined to create an all-marble building to cover this unsightly brick facade. Although he had no training in architecture, and Florence had no tradition of building in marble, and no marble, Michelangelo nonetheless promised to create the most beautiful work in all of Italy. Michelangelo's ambition was shared by his contemporaries, by the patrons willing to underwrite the extraordinary cost, and by Florentines who watched with excited wonder as great quantities of marble began arriving from the distant marble quarries 90 miles away. But as you probably know, San Lorenzo never got its marble facade. Although this computer simulation of Michelangelo's all-marble facade has prompted some persons recently to call for the building of the facade now, 500 years later, but they're basically trying to raise money from American patrons. Michelangelo was bitterly disappointed when, after devoting enormous energy and 3 years of his life, when Pope Leo X finally canceled the project in March 1520. Yet the marble did not go to waste. It was used in the Medici Chapel. And the engineering expertise gained was also put to good use in the construction of the Laurentian Library and subsequently in the building of St. Peter's in Rome. With little experience in architecture, Michelangelo set out to construct an ambitious facade, a funerary chapel, and a library at San Lorenzo, all simultaneously. It required Michelangelo to hire and supervise a labor force of some 300 persons. He quarried marble blocks of a size and quantity unequaled in more than 1,000 years from alpine quarries that he developed and even today are virtually inaccessible, with a transport system that he organized and staffed, accounted for, and policed, with equipment that was made and borrowed and sometimes defective, with oxen and carts that had to be scoured from farmers and boats that had to be rented, and a crane that had to be built and frequently repaired. He selected and inspected all of his materials. He arranged for rope, tackle, and boats, haggled with carters about fees, and made designs for even the tiniest, seemingly insignificant detail on sheets also used to make calculations, count bushels of grain, draft a letter, or compose poetry. And when politics disrupted building, Michelangelo took up military engineering, turning his expertise in labor force to the task of defending Florence, which he did with great success. And this is one of many drawings that Michelangelo, he was hired as a military engineer to defend Florence during 1529-30 siege of Florence. And he actually built these fortifications in temporary form. He was the master fortification. He once said, "I don't know very much about architecture, but I'm an expert at fortifications." This is not the solitary genius that we inherited from most previous scholarship, nor from the agony and the ecstasy. If an entrepreneur is one who organizes, manages, and assumes the risks of a corporate enterprise, then I was right to characterize Michelangelo as an entrepreneur. This organizational chart emphasizes Michelangelo's centrality to each and every operation. He is literally at the center, and everything flows through him. In comparison to a modern business enterprise with a pyramidal organization, Michelangelo's operation was not efficient. But the diagram tells us that Michelangelo was involved in every facet of the complex operation, and he never slept, and he never took Sunday off. And the results are some of the most sublime works of Renaissance art. If you have a chance to visit the Medici Chapel, consider the engineering and the logistics behind the innovative architecture and the sublime sculptures, all carved with these simple tools. Those tools were employed by Michelangelo's assistants to carve this tabernacle and such miraculous details as these strands of marble rope looped through a hole in metallic-looking paterae. Meanwhile, Michelangelo was busy transforming marble into flesh and soft folds of drapery. Those same simple tools in the hands of a master craftsman will build St. Peter's when Michelangelo is in his 70s and 80s, a story I will tell in my third lecture. So to conclude, I'd like to relate an anecdote regarding Michelangelo's earliest collaboration. We might say the very beginning of his life as an entrepreneur. One of the first articles I published was about the 13 persons who assisted Michelangelo in painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. They are documented, but they had been left out of the heroic story of the lone genius who did the ceiling all by himself. Who were those individuals and what were they doing there? Sound like familiar questions? Some were specialists in constructing the scaffolding and preparing the highly irregular vault for painting. A few carried buckets of water up ladders 65 feet to the ceiling level where they mixed the powdered paints, trimmed brushes, and cleaned up the paint pots at the end of the day. Others were there helping to enlarge drawings to cartoon size, and then to transfer the large cartoons to the curved surface of the vault, at least a 3-person operation. And a few select individuals, about 4, were actually painting alongside Michelangelo. What did they paint? Well, there are several miles of architectural decoration and a few thousand shells and acorns adorning the architecture. And Michelangelo, I assure you, did not paint a single acorn or shell. But there are also a host of minor figures and decorative motifs that Michelangelo delegated to his assistants. This was the first lesson for his later career, for in fact, this was the very first project that required him to collaborate with others. When I wrote my article, I was interviewed by a British tabloid about my findings. To my chagrin, the following day, the headline read, "American." And please note that the Brits insisted on leading with a clear nationalist identification. "American scholar declares that Michelangelo did not paint the Sistine ceiling." I will always be grateful to my home institution for not considering this piece of evidence in my case for promotion to tenure at Washington University. Washington University has allowed me to pursue my research and to share that interest with you in these lectures. I hope you will join me tomorrow for the second of this series, Michelangelo Aristocrat. Thank you very much.
You'll take questions?
I'd be happy to.
And I'll see if I can figure out how to make this go. Chris, I'm sorry. Sue.
Well, I can speak loud, so I don't need the microphone. I am so struck by the content of the recording of Carrara, and to see those ropes and impression into the marble. Did he continue going up through his 80s? Was there a time he couldn't make that?
Well, no. The question is, did Michelangelo continue to go? First of all, it's remarkable that the artists would go to the quarries at all. For the most part, artists didn't have to go to the quarries because there was always the cathedral. The cathedral was a sort of the supplier of supplies for artists. And so if you wanted to carve a sculpture, you could go to the Cathedral of Florence, and you could usually get a block of marble. But of course, Michelangelo wanted an enormous amount of marble. He was a glutton for marble. And then he was also very particular about the quality of his marble. So what's unusual is not only the number of times he went to the marble quarries, but how much time he spent there. I've added it up all together. It's about 4 years that he spent up in the marble quarries. So he made repeated trips there, about 30, during the period when he was working at San Lorenzo. No, by the time he's working in Rome in his 70s and 80s, no, St. Peter's is not built of marble, it's built of travertine. And that travertine, and I'll talk more about this when we talk about the third lecture, the travertine is coming more locally. It's not coming quite from 90 miles away, but it's coming, this all has to be carted along, the rivers to Rome. But by then, the process is pretty much well organized. Although he oversees it, and he's still responsible for it in every way, and he will check all of his materials, he's not setting up the operation in the same way that he was setting it up, because nobody had quarried all that marble and needed that much marble in the 1520s. And so that's why he was opening those marble quarries, building those paths, organizing the transport to Florence, which had not really been done since Roman times. So this was an extraordinary moment in his career when he was intending to build the most beautiful facade of all time.
Were you serious when you said he never slept?
Oh, no. No, this is one thing I don't know. I suspect he didn't. We know a lot about everything, what he ate, how he dressed. We know a lot about his personal life, but no, we don't know about his sleeping habits. He suffered from kidney stones, so maybe he didn't sleep very well. No, I just suspect that, from all that he did, that he... and they tended to, we know that the workday was sun up to sundown. So as long as he was young, he was on the work site, sun up to sundown all the time. So, when he gets older in the 70s and 80s, he would show up at St. Peter's maybe later in the day because he had Kapellmeister, the people who were in charge of the workforces. They would be there first thing in the morning at sunrise. But yeah, he moved a little bit slower in his 70s and 80s, but he's still the responsible architect.
Hey, Bill. One always thinks of San Maria del Fiore, the cathedral, as the model for Brunelleschi.
Yes.
And just hearing you talk, I hadn't thought about the marble and the sourcing for marble for all of that massive project. Was that useful information? Was Michelangelo able to benefit? Was he using the same quarries, or is that a completely different project?
No, Brunelleschi's quarries are down Massa Marittima, so down closer to Siena. That's where he got the marble for the lantern. And the only part of the Cathedral of Florence that is marble is the lantern. And it is a lot of marble. It's a beautiful big lantern. And you're absolutely right. The Cathedral of Florence is the model of all great domes, and it will be Michelangelo's model for St. Peter's for sure. But in terms of the materials, the model there is the rope and the equipment. He got a lot of his equipment from the cathedral because the cathedral was the source of rope. You needed tons and tons of rope, and the best quality rope was to be had from a place like the cathedral, which was constantly being constructed or being repaired. So rope was a kind of nightmare, actually, and it was one of the things that just drove him to utter distraction. But he learned a lot from seeing Brunelleschi's old equipment and his hoists, the things that he used to carry the stone up to Brunelleschi's level. The difference is that Michelangelo was using blocks of stone that were very much larger than Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi's stones are fairly small because he didn't know how to hoist big blocks of stone very high. Michelangelo's hoisting blocks of stone, 22-foot high columns. Nobody had done that since Roman times, so Michelangelo's really kind of inventing it all new. But he learned a lot from Brunelleschi's model, for sure.
The St. Louis Art Museum sculpture pan is
Yeah.
famously recycled marble from a Roman statue. Did Michelangelo ever use any of his works from recycled
Yes.
marble?
Yes, probably his Florentine Pietà, which is the one in Florence, is probably the largest marble he ever carved other than David. Has 4 figures, and he carved it as his own tomb memorial. And that was apparently a Roman architectural block. And it may be one of the reasons why he ran into so much trouble with that sculpture, because as you may know, Christ is missing a leg, and Michelangelo gave up on the sculpture because it found the marble rather intractable. But there's other sort of psychological reasons of the problems of carving your own grave memorial during your own lifetime is a little bit problematic. You know, you finish your grave, you're ready to die. So Michelangelo was never ready to die. He didn't die until 89. So there were lots of reasons why he had trouble, with that particular block of marble. But yes, he did, and he helped supervise lots of working of old Roman statues. That's the Montorsi in the St. Louis Art Museum is just one of several examples we know that Michelangelo and Montorsi himself, the Laocoon, the very famous Laocoon, was also partly restored by Montorsi, the same artist, carved a really great arm for Laocoon that the Vatican should put back on that sculpture.
Bill, as you mentioned, you spend a lot of time on location in archives. I just remember when I worked for Dean of Libraries, Shirley Baker, back in the 80s, you had discovered a very important piece of, I think, his grocery list or something like that.
I think I'll show it to you in lecture 2 or 3.
So my question is, back then before the internet, these pieces of information must have been scattered all around the world. How did you find them?
Well, that's wonderful. We should pump the fact that Washington University owns a Michelangelo document. It's the only Michelangelo document in a university collection anywhere in the United States. So I will be showing it to you. And it wasn't I did not discover it. It was an undergraduate music major, Larissa Beyer, who found it. She found it, but she didn't quite know how to read it, and she forgot to tell me about it because she thought that I knew everything about Michelangelo. But she finally did mention that she had seen this Michelangelo document, and then we sort of went up to the library, and yes, it was like, wow, we have a Michelangelo document. But the fact is that Michelangelo was extremely careful. This is mostly the topic of my second lecture. He is an aristocrat, and he's very conscious of his own self-fashioning and his own persona. So he kept his papers, and much of the Michelangelo archive is still intact and still with the family, and the family lived until 1853. So much of that paper material, those 1,400 letters, for example, are all intact with the Buonarroti archive. So we have an immense amount of material from Michelangelo. What I largely found in the quarrying was going to the bank records. And the bank records also are pretty well preserved because these are family banks. The Salviati Bank, the Salviati still exist. The family still exists, and they've turned their records over to the state archives, and one can go to the state archives and find these old bank records that are 500 years old. The Italians they're completely disorganized in their personal lives, but in terms of record keeping, they're amazing. They invented double record bookkeeping and things. They really knew how to do banking and things like that really well in the Renaissance, and they kept very, very good records. Yeah. So we do have an immense amount of raw material, primary documentation.
I was wondering if Michelangelo had a confidant or any one person that he had beside him when he was doing all.
Oh, yes. No, and this is one of the other things that's a sad thing that I've tried. My long part of my career is to reintroduce these people that were very close to Michelangelo. He had a series of friends that were extraordinarily close to him, and that some were somewhat like business managers, but the business managers were also extraordinarily close friends who generally lived with Michelangelo, and these people would live with him for 10, 20, 15 more years. One of the saddest parts of Michelangelo's life is that he outlived all of these people. So he had a succession of people that he was very close to, and they were very close to him, and took care of a lot of his day-to-day, his own personal papers and possessions and things like that, and did a lot of his busy work for him. And he depended on those people, and they are critical, actually, to the efficiency of his keeping things going, because he had a lot of things doing. And that's really kind of one of the long sad stories of his career, is that he just outlived his entire family, and probably at least a half dozen of these people with whom he was extraordinarily close for 10 or more years at a time.
So we've had gestures towards the aristocratic Michelangelo for tomorrow and the octogenarian for Friday. Please join us again for 4:30 here for those lectures. And now I think it's time to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.